Hello, everybody. This is Tufan Güven. I am a biophoton therapist, organizer, a presenter on fractal field science, and a student of Dan Winter. So today's session is part of the spring online program. We will have a second class today with Teresa Burns and Ellen Moore on the esoteric history of Shakespeare, John Dee, alchemy at 10 a.m. New York time and 3 p.m. UK time. So also, we will have another class with Dan Winter this week on Thursday about the science of perception, which will take place on the 9th of April at 11 a.m. UTC. So we originally programmed these lectures for our educational program in Bodrum. That's why the timing of Dan's classes are a bit late for the ones in the US, but we will upload these talks online. The sponsors of these talks are fractalfield.com, Dan's official website, and geometricmodels.com. And you can check out for some tools, geometrical educational tools. Some tools are from Dan and mentioned in his teachings. So we are going through interesting times, and these are the times that we have to pay extra attention to our vitality and immunity in order to have a strong immune system, both on a physical and spiritual level. I also have a private practice in holistic healing where we use biophoton light in a biofeedback loop, which has proven itself to be one of the most eloquent ways of healing the body from chronic illnesses. And you can find more information at biontology.com. And I will also be putting the websites here on the chat box, and I will also include them under the video of this session when we post it online. So today, Dan Winter is joining us to talk about the spiritual hygiene, which is something that we all need to be mindful of. So for those who do not know Dan, one can talk about Dan's achievements for hours, but just to make it short, Dan is the pioneer of the modern fractal field physics, combining both physics and spirituality in a way that no one has ever accomplished before. So he's able to explain negentropy, gravity, perception, bliss experience, enlightenment, life force, alphabet, and symbol with one unified physics, which also leads us to the spiritual hygiene, today's lecture. So without further ado, I would like to hand it over to Dan Winter. Welcome, Dan, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Tufan. Tufan is a real hero of ours. He's really taken the work of making this teachable at a very practical level and done amazing work both here at our conference in France and Turkey. I'm delighted to work with Tufan Güven. It's wonderful. And yes, so today we want to seriously talk about science and spiritual hygiene. Today you might imagine I'm perhaps pretending to be a spiritual counselor, but presumably everything I say is spiritual counseling based on electrical engineering, which is my field, obviously. So to start somewhere, I would like to suggest that current science has done an excellent job of looking at the structure of cells in biology and DNA, for example. What current science has virtually completely failed to do is to understand how the field effect or plasma that inhabits things like DNA, how that plasma or field effect becomes negentropic, self-aware, and intelligent. That is the specific thing that science has missed, unfortunately, which appears to then reduce science's ability to talk about spirituality. As soon as science becomes aware of how living plasma toroidal domains become self-aware, negentropic, interactive, and quote-unquote intelligent, as soon as science notices that plasma domains themselves become intelligent in and of themselves, that's the moment that physics can talk about spirituality. And Unfortunately, not until. Interestingly, our friend George Edgley, famously in Budapest, gave a bunch of amazing talks about how telepathic ball lightning is. This is I use this example often, but it's a good example that there are countless reports that ball lightning responds to human emotion and telepathy. Well, what does physics have to say about that? Unfortunately, nothing. But until physics grapples with that problem, then things like the burning bush in the Bible are completely beyond the ken of physics. Now, interestingly, we have the plasma universe people who are doing an excellent job recognizing that plasma is 99.999% of the universe. And interesting, most of the scientists working with plasma universe work these days appear to believe in angels. And they believe that plasma domains, which are interstellar, can be aware. Now, I had the good fortune to work with John McGovern, goldenmean.info/whale dreamers, where he became the co-author with Tony Peratt at Los Alamos Plasma Research Lab, where, Tony in the Plasma Research Lab in physics Los Alamos had shown 9 plasma donuts nested one above the other appear to become self-aware and self-organizing. And later this was the 9 levels of Pagoda and Dante's Inferno and the Ennead and all those physics of 9, which is probably why you have basically 9 chakras. There's 2 above, plasma domains. And this was the physics of why the Anunnaki always identified their power by where they stood in the 9, because that's physics, actually, and that's known plasma physics. So the point is that the charge domain around your body has the potential to become, quote unquote, independently self-aware. That's the beginning of the idea of spirit, and the beginning of the idea of understanding what you take with you when you dream and when you die, which we think is very important. And the amount by which that domain of charge is coherent, we say, in religion they call it the quality of grace or the spirit. In physics we call it the coherent of the charge domain, the coherence. In Egypt we think they called it the Ka, the boat into the underworld. And the part of that charge domain that implodes through Planck at the center and propagates longitudinally, enabling lucid dreaming and surviving death, we believe the Egyptians call that the Ba. And getting coherence so that your aura can implode and then propagate longitudinally, we think is a very useful physics for studying the science, and I do mean science, of learning how to lucid dream, which we think is clearly the uniquely appropriate mechanism for learning how to take memory through death. So, and you've all heard me do this song and dance so many times about how longitudinal EMF propagation is the physics behind so much of spiritual tradition. That, remember, and you can find this at fractalfield.com/conjugate mind, all those images. So in today's conversation, I'm going to mention links and leave you to go play with the pictures there. Some limitations in Learn It Live and limitations of bandwidth. So today you're stuck with my face, but the many links we will be mentioning have all the pictures. So again, just a 1-minute review of, because we believe it's so important, that most of physics for communications use what's called transverse electromagnetic propagation, which means simply that the electromagnetic wave that's going up and down, perpendicular to the direction of propagation, called transverse electromagnetics, is all of the communications theory on the planet today. However, when that up and down motion approaches a vortex, a pine cone, the up and down motion travels down a very accurate spiral on the vortex cone, imploding, compressing out precisely at the Planck threshold, according to my new equation entitled Origin of Biologic Negentropy, integer exponents of golden ratio phase conjugation times precisely Planck length and time, that at that compression point, the toothpaste tube squeeze, as it were, the transverse up and down inertia is compressed and changes to a compressional wave without loss of inertia, without loss of power. And that propagating compressional wave, appropriately called longitudinal EMF propagation, it's like the slinky is compressing this way, and a compression wave that's parallel to the direction of propagation, called longitudinal EMF propagation. And in some have called it scalar or torsional, which are less useful terms in my view. And that now we understand that longitudinal EMF propagating, when that compressional wave longitudinally can go faster than the speed of light. We believe it's golden ratio times the speed of light, as Professor Raymond Chow measured, which proves my physics of gravity, namely that if in fact the most dominant speed faster than light is golden ratio times the speed of light, as Professor Raymond Chow famously measured, that is absolute proof, my theory of gravity is correct, that the acceleration of charge down that vortex experienced because of phase conjugate adding and multiplying recursively constructively the phase velocity heterodyne, that turns the compression into acceleration of charge due to accurate fractal compression, how fractality causes gravity, and the emerging longitudinal wave that measurably travels faster than light is the way out for charge at the center, answering Einstein's dilemma of what is infinite compression of charge, which is his definition of gravity, effectively saying the longitudinal EMF propagation is gravity waves. And that's another subject, but if you've ever seen saints floating, as I believe Valerie's friends here have, in fact, it's quite well documented that people can float under conditions of intense bliss. And those who understand why an object falls to the ground, like me, understand very well how humans can produce propulsion if in a certain state of electrical implosion, paying your debt to gravity, as it were. So this is a physics we've been introducing for years, and I have dozens of films about longitudinal fields and spiritual phenomena. To make one last point about this, that when that compressional wave, which can go through anything, Faraday cage, no problem, about anything. And we now know the physics of how Ingo Swann famously lit the thermistor at a distance with his mind through a Faraday cage repeatedly in a laboratory. It was measured. He lit a flame with his mind, which is why our technology for measuring this golden ratio phenomenon, EEG, named Bliss, is flameinmind.com. We know how he did it and why. And we know that Einstein was wrong to call action at a distance spooky, because, in fact, we understand precisely when the longitudinal wave then crosses at a distance at a perpendicular cross point, called four-wave mixing in phase conjugate optics, there, that compressional inertia can, if it recompresses in proper vortex cone accurate symmetry, four-wave mixing, in spiritual tradition it's called the sacred four directions, then that longitudinal inertia will resynthesize the heat containing transverse component, and you can light a fire at a distance with your mind. Otherwise, in Tom Bearden's notation, this would be called the Russian woodpecker. And remember, the Russians got the longitudinal EMF, quote-unquote, scalar torsional scientists after the war. The Americans got the rocket scientists. So the Russians understood this perfectly well, which is why their technology makes our Navy look pretty dumb quite often, because they don't understand action, or at least they call it a big military secret. But if they're right that it's a big military secret, that means the most powerful thing you can do with your mind is a big military secret. And we don't think it should be secret. In fact, our lives are an experiment in sharing, which we think shareable waves are how you get immortal. So that's why we're here. Anyway, but you begin to get an idea. Not only is that the key to action at a distance, but that introduces one of the most important components of our hygiene for spirituality, which is that those nodes where Earth magnetic line crosses accurately perpendicular, these sacred ley line crosses, Earth magnetic line crosses, whatever you will, some dowsing skill is essential to spiritual hygiene. And as you know, that Bruce Cathy, at those cross points where the speed of light divides evenly into the circumference, he measured a reduction in nuclear critical mass. We understand the physics perfectly. And we know the Kozyrev mirrors people would measure in nanoteslas the flux density at Earth ley line crosses before they put the microwave coherent metal cylinder called cozy red mirror, where military quality telepathy was achieved every time. We know what that telepathy was. That telepathy was the enabling of the longitudinal embedding of those magnetic line cross points, as Korotkov so often measured. So that's an introduction to why every labyrinth and cathedral and sacred site and stone circle and your burial ground, hopefully, and where you want to do bliss and birth and death, well, they were all at these magnetic line node cross points. Another example of that, and we've spoken this many times, is why, the moment when you feel your hair absolutely stand up at the moment they light the Agnihotra flame, as we did in Poland, where they had turned that area into a Garden of Eden with Agnihotra alone, happened precisely at sunrise, sunset, because that also is that perpendicularity of angle enabling the longitudinal embedding, which tells you something about a good time to do your bliss meditation and your telephone calls to ancestors. So you're beginning to get an idea that once you begin to think of these things using science, that you get some pretty useful practical tools to enable you to do what is essential to achieve, I call it immortality. The ability to get a big aura, as we've said many times, is a very appropriate way to define success in life and success spiritually, because that large aura, which is just a charged donut, is what you take with you when you dream and die. And I don't think any scientist could disagree that that then becomes a very useful description of purpose of life. Your memories exist in your aura. Now, one thing that there's several problems we hope to solve with these kinds of dialogues, and I've been doing this for too many years. My hair looks a little gray. Oh, my father's hair was gray quite young too, so. But the problems we hope to solve with these dialogues, one, by eliminating the need for miracle worship and personality worship, replacing that with self-empowerment, we eliminate the need for religion wars. And then spirituality becomes something that governments can agree upon. There are many benefits to a true, and I do mean a true, physics of spirituality. Another problem that is solved is what I call the schizophrenia of religious fundamentalists, and some of them I think were in my extended family, actually, which is that they said, oh, well, that's my spiritual body, and this is my physical body, and they're separate. That's a form of schizophrenia, because people who've been studying spiritual traditions for so long forget that all their words for spirituality, like spirit and chi and orgo and baraka, are only names for the physics of charge. Suddenly, it is not okay to be schizophrenic thinking that your spiritual body is somehow separate from your physical body. No, physical means phi cycles of phi, for a very good reason, because the charge propagation enabled by cycles of phi, called phi cycle or physical, is precisely what is spiritual. So this also means that you're learning how to propagate your aura, and you come to understand the real definition of power, which is simply charge propagation. So now let's do one more little 2-minute segment on the deep science behind this, which is the unified field nature of the physics of charge. Because, and we've done this many times, but I think it bears repeating, that once you truly kind of quote unquote religiously accept the idea of the unified nature of charge, and that charge is both spiritual and physical, then it's impossible to return to the schizophrenia of separateness. So, I strongly suggest that the universe is comprised of a single contiguous medium, the compressibility of charge, which is and behaves like a superfluid, as many like Nassim agree. And the compression and rarefaction of that charge is what we call plus and minus charge. And so that is the unified field, and that is the ether. Now, when that charge rotates, it stores the inertia, which is the only definition of mass. When that charge rotates, it has a period, and the period of the rotation of the charge is the only definition of time. So don't let these people confuse you about, well, time is separate and time is imaginary. No, that's all crap. The fact is, time is simple. It is the rate of rotation of charge, nothing more. So that's why physicists get you so profoundly confused when they say, well, a space-time continuum, if you go fast enough, approach the speed of light, suddenly your clock changes. Well, it's quite simple. As the rotating donut you call your watch is accelerating, the rate of rotation of the charge in the atoms in that watch is affected, and that's named time. So, finally, that introduces us to what happens when charge implodes and becomes negentropic or self-organizing, for example, in phase conjugate optics or in your aura when you have bliss. Now, in optics, they measured that becoming negentropic, self-organizing. That is, the universe is not condemned to entropy, as the physicists erroneously claim. No, there is a path out of chaos. Thank you very much, once you understand the origin of negentropy. And the second point, and again, we're repeating things we've talked about many times, that when physics says that in phase conjugate optics they have measured time reversal, the only thing they actually mean is they have measured a return to order. And that is proven by the fact that they have time reversed rusted steel to become unrusted, but you cannot do the opposite. You cannot go backwards in time toward disorder. No, not according to physics. So you see that what's called time reversal in physics actually is simply return to increased order, or negentropy. So, and the reason negentropy or self-organization exists at that pine cone kissing noses implosion point of Planck threshold, where the longitudinal propagates, is because from that point of perfect convergence, maybe we should call it the harmonic convergence. The harmonic convergence. The perfect harmonic convergence is phase conjugation to Planck, obviously. And what happens at that point is every wave that is sucked in or arrives there has to emerge either one of two ways. Either having become embedded in perfected phase discipline called increased order, or having been canceled out. So that's why the witch's pentacle going one way. He says you're banishing the spell. Well, all you're doing is you're banishing the charge to implode, and at the center of implosion, only the shareable wave survives. This will be a slight ad for Shelley Evans' new website, theshareablewave.com. But the perfectly shareable wave is obviously the one that achieves distribution by achieving symmetry agreement, otherwise known as purification or negentropy. So at the perfection of plasma flame, where the waves do converge perfectly, you get this sorting phenomenon. Now, this might be a good point in the conversation to apply this to our discussion of immune health versus charge in this time of pandemic. So we have been discussing this at length, and the web article is goldenmean.info/holarchy, HOLARCHY, 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 goldenmean.info/holarchy, and the links are in the chat window. And that's our article about how the immune system is charged by frequencies. And this would be a practical biologic example of achieving a more shareable wave, in this case, the membrane you call your immune health, due to harmonic inclusiveness, fractality, perfect way for waves to converge. So the article begins, first of all, a short political ad here. It's also an ad for Therify.net, our plasma. And as Victor Vallone wrote yesterday from the Therify Center in New Jersey, his friend believes that he saved her life by going to her house every day for a week to treat her pneumonia. Now that's anecdotal, and we are looking for much more rigorous data, and this plasma system is totally experimental, but the anecdotal reports number in the thousands, so this is interesting. And there's a lot more to this, and we don't promote any simplistic solutions. But now we're talking about principle. And so the principle of immune health versus fractal harmonic inclusiveness summarized. As Irving Dardick, in the pictorial at that article, so well documents that in medicine and the medical literature, the fastest way to measure your immune system's health is to measure for harmonic inclusiveness in your heart, called heart rate variability. Very simple. If your heart rate is stuck in one place, you better get your life insurance paid up your toast. If your heart harmonics are inclusive, there's lots and lots of different harmonics present. The more inclusive, the more you have an immune system. And that's medically proven. And one of the reasons why heart rate variability studies are the most published subject in all of medicine, some people say. Because heart rate variability, the fractal heart is a healthy heart, is a good example of a paper by our friend Ari Goldberg. So the principle of how the most number of harmonics can get into your heart at once without those harmonics interfering with each other is the problem that fractality golden ratio solves, named non-destructive compression. So get fractal or get dead has some medical evidence. This is cool. Now, once we applied that to heart harmonics, that became our iThrive, ITHRVE.com, heart rate variability breathing, yoga breathing system. Is very inexpensive, like $20. Biofeedback. We have 6 different apps. craniosacral-app.com, you'll find Patrick's site of many of our apps. And if we apply that to EEG brainwaves, you get flameinmind.com, the golden ratio recipe for brainwave harmonics embedding to create bliss and peak perception, which is the full hour subject of our next class with Tufan in 2 days. 2 days? Yes. Something. So what we did for the plasma system, Therify.net, we simply took the equation for what is those maximum number of contained harmonics and put it into plasma. So the plasma goes into this noble gas, which is an optical phase conjugator, in phase with the megahertz 500,000 volt drive frequency complex wave pair, which is 180 degrees out of phase for opposite tubes, which is how you conjugate. And then we mix that with the low frequencies, complex wave, about 10 to 15 harmonics, all of the above, from ELF to brain harmonics to megahertz harmonics to optical harmonics, are locked into phase with my equation, golden ratio, integer exponents, and Planck. So it's a perfect pair of pine cones kissing noses. And we believe that the broader the spectra of the conjugation, the more dense the negentropy. And so there are many next steps we can have fun with here, including making stargates and portals. Because when you go through this with enough focus charge inertia, you can ride that longitudinal wave, and we know what the advanced, I guess you have to say military people like Randy Kramer and Jason Rice are teaching at Gaia.com, where they use these portals all the time. That is, in fact, a way to compress the inertia of your aura with sufficient density to actually propagate you through the speed of light by golden ratio. And the pickup point has to be precisely symmetric, and that's a bit of another story. The point is that you need to have a conception of what these portals are if you even want to have a clue to what Jerusalem was. Uru, Asa, El, M. It's quite simple. Uru, ancient dragon blood. Asa, the queen royalty of. El, the place of the translation of vorticity or phase shift from transverse to longitudinal. And of course, you want to have a war over the Stargate. Well, most of the wars are, except, hello, as we joke about it, but it's true. You know, they should cancel that war because that Stargate's broken. Better build another one once you know the physics. And yes, the reason they have wars over Stargates is because if you're stuck in a kindergarten a long way from downtown, it ain't fun. But if you having a war over Jerusalem, which is a broken Stargate, is like bees having a fight over the memory of the last place there was honey, having forgotten how to make honey. So we're not going to go into the advanced physics of Stargates or any of that stuff today. Now today we're focused on the practical hygiene, but we've given a little background now. So now we're going to try to translate some of that into some practical hygiene, and we're going to suggestions, and we're going to divide that into areas of clothing and environment versus building architecture versus diet versus the psychology. What is it about thought versus yoga, and all of those areas we can tune our knowledge of spirituality by using electrical engineering. Let's start with clothing and architecture. So, for example, I wanted to explain, I have this shirt here. Let me just give you an example. Remember, when we talk about architecture and clothing, what we're doing is we're having a conversation about which material can best propagate your aura. Now, in physics, the name for that is called dielectric constant, which means efficiency of propagation of charge or capacitance. Actually, it's called dielectric permittivity. A practical example is that biologic materials, cotton, hemp, etc., wood, when the molecule enters biology, there's a sign there that says, welcome to the club. It's very popular, the club called biology for molecules. But if you want to join the club of biology and you're a molecule, you have to obey the bumper sticker, which is get fractal or get dead. A little humor here. So the molecules in biologic structure arrange themselves more fractally in order to achieve better charge distribution efficiency, named higher dielectric constant. The result of that is efficient capacitance. The result of that is efficient distribution of charge. The result of that is called life. So that's the physics of why you really don't want to associate with religious orders whose monks wear polyester robes, because you know they miss something. But the example I wanted to give was, for dielectric constant, quality of capacitance, why use biologic material in both architecture and clothing, and why steel and aluminum are the opposite in death to life force propagation, because the wrong dielectric constant. There's other issues. Hemp, for example, is some of the most vibrant material on the planet in most cases. So anytime you can get hemp for clothing or architecture, you're in heaven. It's some of the best DNA around, we think. Because, dielectric constant. But I wanted to give you one other example here, since I'm wearing this shirt, and these shirts I wear, Valerie says I wear them way too much. I wear them out because it's cotton, but the surface is smooth. Now here's another cotton shirt, and this shirt, the surface is, I don't know if you can see it, but the surface is fuzzy. Now, whenever I put on a fuzzy cotton shirt, I feel my aura get weaker within about 5 minutes. I can feel it quite dramatically. Now, I think I understand the physics, because actually the dimensions of that fuzz is the wavelength of the capacitance that's bleeding. For the same reason why a sharp needle for a church called a Catholic church is actually bleeding the geobiology, and you can actually sue the church and the radio tower people with a 25-cent test. You can take them to court. You measure the soil compaction die. The microbes in the soil die next to a sharp peak in your soil. So a farmer that has a radio tower stuck in by someone else should measure the soil compaction right next to the radio tower and prove in court that the microorganisms were killed in that soil by that sharp peak. Because that dissipates capacitance. Versus, so does that mean the Catholic churches with sharp steeples are parasites? I will leave the discussion to you. But the Eastern churches, the steeple looks like an onion. Now, is that more fractal? Well, another practical example of this is that we know that the negative ion wind therapy, which is proven to be profoundly disinfecting, some people say the joys of Negative ion wind therapy, cell care therapy, says that she could eliminate even stubborn spinal meningitis infection using just negative ion wind therapy. And there are parallels, great parallels to cold plasma therapy, Therify.net. And Joyce was absolutely insistent that her negative ion wind and probably our Therify plasma therapy will not work if you put them in a room full of plastics and synthetic fabrics and steel and aluminum. The gadgets do not heal people. No. But if you put the natural materials in the room, the high dielectric, then the charge propagation efficiency, and the plasma cloud, which is self-aware. Remember, all of our therapists, most of them agree, you have to treat the plasma cloud around the therapist like a temperamental pet kitten. Yes, the kitten will come up to you and run its motor and heal you if it likes you. So the first thing you do with the plasma cloud, I mean the pet kitten, is you have it like you. And the first thing you do if you're Therify or negative ion wind, or if you have this plasma cloud you want to heal people, is anybody who comes into the room with a negative attitude, you immediately and very gently invite them to leave. Come back another time when you're feeling positive, because the plasma cloud won't like you. Well, the point I wanted to make when I started the clothing conversation was that it's also true in healing charge, like spiritual aura or plasma, Therify or negative ion wind, that if you have fuzzy clothing or rugs, the capacitance will dissipate to some extent also. Now, this is where we review the obvious. Well, you're probably better off without the metal in your belt buckle. In fact, any spiritual saint will tell you, first thing you do when you want to go to God, I mean spirituality, I mean charge, is remove all the metal from your body. The other thing you definitely want is loose-fitting clothing. There's a tremendous tendency in underwear these days. They want all the stretchy stuff. To find an undershirt that's not stretchy, that actually fits loosely, is quite hard. But they don't understand that what the Arabs have known for centuries is that you need loose-fitting clothing, not just for temperature maintenance in your body, but also for charge maintenance. So any clothing that's too fuzzy or sticks to you too tightly. And the other very practical thing about clothing and spiritual hygiene is it's always true, the less clothing, the better. So warm climates are obviously a benefit, for sure. If you want a big aura, and you see all these gurus, they sat around with just a loincloth, and that's how they were growing their aura. They didn't put a lot of clothing on them. Only when it was absolutely required to use any clothing at all. Now, that being said, the other thing that many people don't realize about spirituality and healing, even healing pandemics, is the physics of alchemy and the physics of making stem cells and the physics of having your aura, I mean your cells, implode and have bliss, all requires one specific thing, and that is exquisitely accurate temperature maintenance. Temperature is the issue. I mean, plus minus less than 1/10 of a degree if you want to do alchemy. If you want to take a batch of stem cells and turn them, regular cells, and turn them into stem cells, what's the first thing you do? You get the temperature maintenance very precise. And the same thing is true with getting your cells ready for bliss. The way they make stem cells by taking the cells from your body and putting them somewhere where they're extremely happy. That's all they do to turn a regular cell into a stem cell, is you put a batch of regular cells into an environment which is so carefully designed to make cells perfectly happy, perfect nutrient, perfect temperature. So what I'm saying to you is temperature maintenance is exquisitely rigorous. For bliss, for health, for immune health, charge radiance, for spirituality, for alchemy, for horseshoes, hand grenades, and no. So the other thing that we need to say about that, and again, this is a review of what we had said many times, is look at the hierarchy of fractality in sources of heat, and just meditate for a moment on why you pay so much more for a pizza made in a wood fire and a pizza made in a microwave you might as well throw out. The difference is heat is only a name for randomness of motion. the frequency at which you introduce that motion, named heat, determines the coherence and the fractality. So obviously, the longer the wavelength, the more context-rich the inertia of spin you've added, named heat, the more spiritual. So there's we have this old hierarchy. Sources of heat, from fractal to fractionating. Sources of heat that are profoundly fractal, the best. The sun, gorgeous. Solar heat, direct solar, fabulous. And then, of course, we might have wood heat, and then coal. And then moving down, you'd have gas heat. And then not so good would be electric heat. And then horrible would be microwave heat. And so from fractionation, from fractality to fractionation, the hierarchy of heat is very important to recognize how you're getting health in your aura. So that's why if you go into a house that had a wood fire and a ceramic stove, your aura says, yes, oh cool. You go into a house that has electric heaters with fans, and your aura just went to hell in a handbasket. That's called fractionation versus fractality. So you want to avoid fans at a minimum. We actually have electric heaters, but some electric heaters actually have a liquid media, which makes it a little bit less fractionating. Of course, if you get a wood fire and a ceramic stove. So fractionation to fractality applies to many of these hierarchies. And actually, at goldenmean.info/architecture, we have that fairly famous listing of the order of materials for architecture and biological architecture from fractionation to fractality. So, well, I should say from fractal to fractionating. In other words, for architecture, as Steiner correctly said, children should never touch anything except living material, living fabric, living wood, and living stone. High dielectric constants. Because when your aura can breathe through the material in your architecture, then your body can propagate eureka from your body. And grandma has a place to go at death, you know, if the structure. Whereas any saint in history would not have been a saint for long in an aluminum box full of dead air. Sorry, it ain't going to work. So electrical engineering is essential for sainthood. Anyway, the curriculum for biological architecture in this regard is very evolved. goldenmean.info/architecture. And we have people around the world working on this diligently, as for example, Juan Schlosser there in Bali, who new book and many new articles, you'll see there, the PDFs, where we measured the harmonic inclusiveness of the micro-weak capacitance, the power spectra of the microvolts, and proved harmonic inclusive fractal low frequencies can predict in advance which building will make a seed grow. Compare the seed germination rate with the measurement with the material. So it's elaborately proven why a steel and aluminum box is going to remove the soul from your children. It's measurable. You know exactly which architect should get a paycheck. It's measurable science. Biological architecture is science. And we're developing a whole line of new commercial products in that regard. I see that there's about 15 minutes left, and we want to save a few minutes for questions here. And I didn't, so I'm going to leave now the clothing and architecture conversation. That architecture article is very good, and move on to other fields. First, the diet field, you know, it's something we've talked about many times. We will spend just a few moments. The value of live food, the value of live enzyme food, and how that enables charge propagation. And, you know, as you choose your vegetables in the store, and you whisper to them, when was the last time you knew genetic diversity? What you're doing is you're saying, when did you get fractality in your self-awareness in your DNA? And the right oil, from Lorenzo's oil, that conversation, the electrical need for the right oils in your brain, for example, the good olive and the hemp oil, etc., and the value of live food and salad. Unfortunately, you do need high-quality protein. Well, I won't say it's unfortunate, but it's difficult. Getting high-quality protein on our planet today that's spiritual is not easy. You know, I use a lot of lentils, garbanzos. I do still eat some seafood, and that's tricky, as you know. And we're not going to go into that conversation in depth. But it is true that when you eat red meat, even eggs sometimes, you become very aware that you are processing the pain of that animal when it died. And that's real. And that's real physics. And so at a minimum, if you if you're using animal products, be thinking about which ones shared happily. You know, when the shaman in Australia would take a fish, they would connect with a fish in lucid dream the night before, and a volunteer would say, "I want to share a memory," and you know, it's real. This is not to be taken lightly. The question here about wearing silk, yes, actually, I think there are some silks that are probably pretty wonderful, but dialectically, it's also true that there's an issue in all these fabrics of how they've been treated chemically, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, there's the issue in cotton, for example, of morgellons, and so getting an organic cotton is tricky, and so these are complicated issues on today's planet. But I am going to turn, since our time is going to run out here, I'm going to turn to a psychology of bliss now, to be thinking about what kind of thoughts enable the attraction of charge. That is something I'd like to leave with you today. You know, when we say it was a eureka moment, we actually mean it's a moment when your hair stood up because you had a shareable thought. Now, you now understand perfectly why your hair stands up when you have a shareable thought. Makes good car commercials, as I understand. Sorry about the joke. But the reason your hair stands up when you have a shareable thought is because you've imploded charge. Now, why does thinking about something with pure principle inside it cause your hair to stand up? Because capacitively you've imploded, obviously. So the collective plasma media, otherwise known as the Holy Ghost or the Communion of Saints, is constantly seeking places to put the spin or charge of the collective mind, as it were, and it must always place those balls of plasma or charge in places where the charge distribution will be enabled and immortalized. So everyone who walks around all day thinking of the most pessimistic and negative thing they can imagine is constantly bleeding charge. Everyone who's walking around thinking about beauty all day and perfection and pure principle, particularly pure principle, they're constantly attracting charge. And the difference is dramatic, and I do mean dramatic. So yes, we're living in a world where horrible things surround us constantly. You know, child abuse, medical abuse, who made the virus. There is a lot of conspiracy theory, and there's a big chunk of it which is probably real. However, if what you can do about it, if there's something very practical and immediate you can do about it, well, that's wonderful. If, however, your biggest contribution is simply to focus on the beauty and the pure principle and the best of everyone, I know it's an old saying, but it's really, really true. If you continuously focus on the beauty and the best in everyone and everything around you, and your eyes are twinkling and your mouth is smiling, it's not just an old adage that everyone will be attracted to you. It's actually good physics that your aura will grow the fastest in your environment. It's because the charge is always jumping on to those people who are joining a shareable wave. And that actually is an introduction to why I spent half my life trying to think about pure principles in physics. I didn't want to spend my life thinking about, well, why did tax law change 1,000 times in the last 20 minutes? No, that is not a good job for my aura. No, what I would like to think is, why do waves converge in the geometry of a pentagram? And that what makes hydrogen structure. Why? Oh, that's how hydrogen makes gravity. Oh, when the waves go down that vortex cone, they connect with the gravity center of all the stars. So now I understood perfectly why Marie Zupa, who co-wrote that famous psi perception of quarks, occult chemistry, where the subatomic particle Anu, which we now know is a slipknot, 7-spin outside, 5 spins inside, the same geometry in the heart of the sun, and the exact muscular geometry of the human heart, 7 layers of muscle, and the exact symmetry of the plasma symmetry at the heart of hydrogen, called Anu, which means sun god, and the exact symmetry of what clairvoyants see at the heart of the sun. Well, now we know exactly why Murray Zupa made these gorgeous paintings that the subatomic particles were impish, joyful, mischievous, having fun. And then she said, but if you look at the subatomic particles in a field of flowers with bees flying around and beautiful everything, the subatomic particles are having a ball. But if you make a picture of the subatomic particles in an aluminum block, in an ugly machine shop, in a dead air, the subatomic particles in there ain't happy. And that's something to meditate on for a while. What do you want to surround yourself with once you know that all particles are part of that collective conscious? But the ones that are allowed embeddability and fractality, they get to be joyful. The ones that are frozen out of embeddability, look at the record of the rate of huge disasters that surround big aluminum plants. Why? Because every single particle in there is in pain. And the Earth is saying, oh, God, that's the most painful thing on my whole body. So there's Iceland, and if you just track it down, aluminum plants have a huge record of disasters and health problems. Why? Because the electric field used to fix the aluminum from the bauxite, isn't the bauxite's evil, but the electric field used to fix the aluminum atom in the matrix array called aluminum is, by definition, one of the most painful things that can happen to an atom. Now you wonder why people in aluminum boxes, would rather die. It's because the universe is self-aware. It's actually true. So let's see. So we talked about thinking pure principle. We talked about diet. We talked about environment. We talked about clothing. One thing we didn't talk about, the yoga, this hygiene of yoga for bliss. And again, this is review. Most of you see me do this, but if you make a spiral with your finger at the right change of speed and the right angle, that when you're done, you will feel a little bit of a prick of tingle at the tip of your finger if you made that spiral with the right change of velocity and geometry. And that is called the quality of grace. That is the physics of charge implosion enacted in movement. And macromolecularly, that's why all these yogas and waveforms and the physics of Tai Chi, moving these plasma bubbles with your attention, where the geometry of attention is fitting, the change of the rate of acceleration over time, if you plot that curve, that itself should become implosive. So that's an introduction to the physics of charge attraction in yoga movement. Okay, I think we have about 5 minutes left. Was that right for questions, Tufan?
Yes. Could you also touch upon the connection of what you have talked about our thoughts and taking memory through birth and death?
You say barcodes? I'm sorry, I missed part of your question.
Our thoughts.
Oh, our thoughts and taking memory through birth and death, yes.
They both have to be shareable, and maybe you can elaborate that a little bit.
Yeah, we do think the geometry of the perfect birth canal will be a golden ratio pressure maxima curve like the centric waveform for love, and that implosion is precisely what brings memory through birth. And the reason underwater birth, for example, so dramatically increases IQ measurably is that when you plot the rate of change of pressure at birth on the skull, the rate of decompression of the skull, if that change of decompression rate over time is more gradual, the unpacking geometry of the dodecahedral skull bones allows continuity of memory. So it is a geometry, everything's a geometry of pressure, obviously. And so for birth and death, the ability to focus on that center of lightning, of where the plasma converges. We've talked many times now as the Heinrich Clouvet form constants proved that the lattice cobweb tunnel spiral sequence of visions seen at the time of death are in fact implosion geometry, and that later Danny Schreiber showed us that also at his death that there was a phonon long wave beat sound that accompanied successful death, and we now know why the death visions are electrically contagious. as Ray Moody so nicely showed, surgeons document, because simply successful death and birth are always a successful black hole, literally a compression vortex. And that's successful charge compression going through the vortex wormhole, compressing non-destructively, is, for example, why things like Sacred Space and the stone altar at Machu Picchu and Therify.net are documented. Very helpful for death and also for releasing ghosts, because what releases them is that ability to propagate through that center of implosive compression contiguously. And that's why if you want to release a ghost, for example, plasma helps, and a black hole helps. It's a place where the wave becomes shareable and distributed in the longitudinal.
Thank you. So we have a question from Philip. He says, "Hi Dan, I was wondering what rates of negative ions in the air you get with Therify. Do you think negative ions are always a good way of measuring the aura charge of the physical space?"
Yes, I see the question. Thank you. Negative ions are wonderful, very useful, very healing, and very fragile. Medical literature is clear. The side of the hospital that gets the negative ions by the seacoast definitely heals faster. That's well proven. Now, Therify itself is very analogous to negative ion wind because the implosive charge in the phase conjugate optics and plasma works like a negative ion. But Therify itself, its primary mechanism of operation isn't negative ions per se. We have a few. You might feel a little cool tip at the implosion tip, but sometimes it spontaneously gets colder, which is a good sign at the plasma tube tip. But negative ion propagation is not the primary mechanism of Therify. But the cold plasma, which is also medically famous for healing, is profoundly parallel to the concept of negative ion healing. But it's not exactly in the same spectrum. Negative ions are wonderful, but that's not the primary mechanism of Therify. Now, that being said, the things which destroy negative ions, which is almost everything, they're very fragile, are also bad for Therify. So big chunks of aluminum or steel, electrosmog, heat, too much heat, all of these things damage negative ion wind and effectively will also weaken the cold plasma. So there's many parallels, but it's not identical. But studying how negative ions heal is a very useful study. And it's very simple. A negative ion, every scientist would agree, is a small black hole. And for the negative ion to continue propagating, the small black hole has to be able to propagate through the media non-destructively. And that is a sacred forest. And that is not a steel and aluminum building full of dead everything.
Any questions, anyone?
Okay. Can you repeat mass is, please? Yes. What is mass? Mass is something you do in church. No. Mass is something physicists talk about. Mass is a name for the inertia stored by rotating charge. And time is a name for the period of rotating charge. So rotating charge is creation. And to sustain rotation, the wavelength has to divide evenly into the circumference, and that is named quantum mechanics. So it's very simple. You know, quanta is not a name for something that's profoundly spiritual inherently. It's simply a name for that. The wavelength has to divide evenly in the circumference to enable the charge to rotate. That's how you create mass and time. Carla K, Therify, how does it work in relation to what we taught? So, reviewing the Therify. Remember, we were tracking the works of Antoine Priory in France, who had healed, documented by the government, thousands of cancers and thousands. It was amazing. And you can read all about the science of Therify at therify.net/static. The science is all there. But summarizing briefly, the noble gas is an optical conjugator. Now we take 500,000 volts to light it up. It's optically conjugate. Now we feed into the two opposing tubes at 180 degrees out of phase 500,000 volts in an RF frequency, also conjugate accurate by equation to Planck, and about 10 to 20 harmonics, low frequency harmonics, exactly golden ratio to Planck, precisely in the spectrum alpha, beta, theta, delta of human brain waves for bliss. So now we have the most important frequencies in human bliss, EKG and EEG, which are in the 0 to 40 hertz, 50 hertz bandwidth, which is how you measure love in the heart and love in the brain. That's all that low frequency stuff. Take those exact frequencies, modulate up accurately RF, at 500,000 volts in megahertz range. Now I've got two signals which are identical, and I split them opposite apart in a bifiller Tesla coil at 500,000 volts and dump them into that plasma. And then place those plasma tubes accurately so they conjugate in pinecone's kiss noses at the center, and you have broad spectral conjugation. For example, Lakowski used golden ratio harmonics capacitively nicely, but there was no plasma, there was no optical, so they didn't have any high frequencies there. Also, they didn't have the two opposing accurately. But Prairie actually had the conjugation happening in the plasma, but he didn't know he needed two opposing tubes, for example, because he didn't know what phase conjugation was. These people tripped over it. Lakowski, Tesla, Prairie, they all tripped over the concept. They had almost the right frequencies, but it's only when I discovered the equation behind those frequencies we were able to employ the principle accurately. Verify.net is now in about 25 countries. Okay, well, I think we had some fun here. I thank you for bringing us together. Too fun.
Thank you very much for joining in, Dan. It was a pleasure, and hope to see you again in 2 days, on Thursday.
It's great being a shareable wave with you all, and let's stay tuned. Let's work on this together. We send blessing. Let's hold the gentleness in our heart. Thank you, everybody. Blessings. Blessings. Bye-bye. See you soon. See you Thursday.
Bye.